Good morning. Thank you very much to the IS Academy and for the organizers for having me here, and to Taya for inviting me. I'm delighted to be able to speak to this event and speak about this issue, which is one of my main focuses, one of my main interests, is building and developing this community that we have worldwide that's working on development in fragile and conflict-affected states. And I think I was asked here, because I was at the bank, I led 3 research projects there in the research group before we moved to the WDR, the World Development Report 2011 on conflict, security, and development. I was the economist on that team, and so grappled with many of the issues that Taya had brought up, and was then in the conflict group, the conflict center, up until last December, when I was asked by SIPRI to lead a research program on security and development, which is a new initiative for SIPRI. It's then starting to think about, well, what are all the implications of all the security and peace research we've been doing for development? But it also has given us a lot of opportunity to have discussions there, bring some of their expertise and enlightenment and information that they have, knowledge about security and peace, to some of the more developing contexts. So it's a great interest to me, and it was an excellent opportunity to think about this while I was preparing the presentation, and think about, where is this research agenda really going? What have we learned? Where are we at? Where are we going? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about who we are, who this global community is that's working on this. Then I'm going to talk about what we're talking about. What are the fragile countries? Why does that matter? And then I've been doing some recent thinking about poverty in fragile states, specifically as we think up to the post-2015 era. So I will be going and looking at some of that data. And that after that, I'll kind of close up by where I think this research agenda is going, and where I think we all can contribute, and where all this community the new researchers, I guess I'm an old face as you've described, but the new researchers are going to be bringing information to this. So there's this global kind of agenda on development in fragile states, and I'm delighted to see what it's progressed to, where we have things like the IS Academy over the last 5 years, and this kind of research initiatives. And just to give you a sense of where this has come from, or what it looked like, and when I joined the bank in 2003, and you had a workshop or a brown bag lunch or some kind of discussion about issues related to conflict. The word fragile didn't exist at the time for our purposes, but wow, it sounds like I'm dating myself. But we would talk about conflict, and when we talked about that, there would be typically 20 people, the same 20 people that would show up in the same room and have a small conversation about it, and everybody would agree, and they would learn some things from each other. But there was not a lot of the uptake from the bank. And I'm actually really excited. I share a lot of your skepticism of the bank, but I'm actually excited by where it has gotten to. And it's reflected as well in our bilateral counterparts in MFAs and other development agencies who are expanding and thinking about this and realizing that there's lots of work to be done. Now, as of last year, they had a fragility forum, for example, at the World Bank, and this was after the WDR, so they had a fragility forum, the first of its kind, where they had 250, 300 people show up. Eventually, they've got a network now, a new cross-cutting support area, which is like one of the global practices, if you're familiar with how the bank is being reorganized. And self-identified, 650, 700 people have signed up already to that cross-cutting support area. So this is 700 people within the bank that think of themselves as people working on issues related to fragility, conflict, and violence. So that shows that we've come a long way. But that reflects the complexity of what we're dealing with. And I thought I would talk about a few of these issues. One is the complexity of bridging this research, policy, and practice divide that we have. I'll explain in the next slide, when I talk about systems, processes, and problems, how that's important. But I think a good example or a good lesson that we learned from the WDR was the scale that we had to do to be able to do that amount of research. We asked for 75 background papers for the World Development Report. This is in a year and a half, so 18 months. Typically a WDR takes about a year. We took a little bit longer. 75 background papers. And there were more than 40, there were almost 50 consultations worldwide about the topic. And it reflects exactly that kind of trying to grapple with that policy to practice to research cycle, and trying to bridge a lot of that embeddedness from a lot of the understandings and perceptions of what conflict, fragility, violence are, and what the experiences of those are globally. Before we could write something that was called a World Development Report on that topic, we needed to actually test what we were finding with the people who were grappling with those issues. So the scale of that shows you the value and the importance of reaching out to policy actors, to reaching out to practitioners on the ground, to reaching out to your counterparts, our national counterparts, et cetera. And the impact of that is determined by how much you've reached out to that group. We also have the challenge, the unique challenge, I think, in this particular field, if you're talking about development in fragile states, of having to bridge these other four kind of spheres of diplomacy, humanitarian, development, and security. That's unique. And so we find ourselves with these extra challenges or these extra kind of obstacles and hurdles that we have in trying to transcend those four different spheres where everybody's trying to accomplish many things at once. In addition to that, so not only is it complicated because we have to connect policy to practice to research, and we're trying to bridge those spheres, but we also have to connect economists, who I agree are often working in their own little zoos, to sociologists, to anthropologists, to lawyers, engineers, and soldiers, the folks that are doing these things on the ground or have an understanding of how the world works. Local practitioners, CSOs, NGOs, this list goes on, you all know from having worked on this, that we have the additional challenge of having to reach out to these other disciplines. So we're doing all this work in these challenging environments, having to bridge all of these gaps, and we're increasingly, I think, transcending this north-south divide, so it's not just Westerners talking to the South. It is increasingly, and I hope it will continue to be more so, the South teaching the South about development and what they've learned from development. In one of my recent papers, I'm talking about poverty reduction. I'll show some results from that in a second. But in there, I note that there's no one alive today in the United States or in most of the Western European countries that has actually succeeded in their own country in eradicating poverty. And yet, we go to those countries for experts on eradicating poverty. And yet, there are many people that have reduced or eliminated poverty in their lifetime in some of the countries that are still developing right now. Those are the people we should be going to and saying, what did you do? Why was it successful? How can we teach other people how to do that? So in addition to all of those challenges, having to reach out to all those people, speak all these different languages, talk across disciplines and across domains and spheres, we also have the challenge that in the countries that we're working on, and with our national counterparts that they are working on because it's their lives, these are extremely complicated problems. And I think it's vital that we approach it with the systems approach. And that's why it was great to see all of this great research coming out of the IS Academy on this topic, precisely because it takes into account the entire systems processes that are involved. There was no point at which people said, well, this, we're just going to focus on this particular concept or this model, and we assume that this will work. Let's assume away all the other problems, which is what economists often do. We have to, if we're to understand these issues, we have to understand that there's systems problems. Once we introduce the systems problems thinking, then we have a useful tool of wicked problems. Now, wicked problems are often seen as not a useful tool, because as soon as you say it's a wicked problem, maybe it sounds like it's insurmountable. But I think it's actually a very liberating concept, so I try to remind people of it whenever I can. Wicked problems were introduced by Riddle and Weber in '73, and then Conklin did a nice rewrite of it later. And it was about how management, it was really more industrial organization and management issues, and how they would occasionally find these kind of problems that they could not find their way out of. And so they describe these kind of features of them, and I've included many of the features that they've listed that are most salient for fragile states here. So first of all, we know that the problem is not well understood in many of these issues, and if you're familiar with fragile states, then you know that this is the case. It includes often incomplete information. We don't fully know or grasp what the issues are, and we may never know that. There may not be enough analysis or enough time in the world to actually get all of the information we need. One of the, I think, most salient, most vexing issues is that they are multidimensional, and it's related to that systems process. We know that the problems can vary, the solutions to the problems can vary across dimensions. And so you can often come up with a good solution. I think this is a good solution because it delivers this impact that we're looking for. And another dimension might be efficiency, effectiveness, budget constraints, etc. All of those things lead you to cycle to another solution. Well, that's a good solution, but this might be a better solution because it's more effective. Well, that's a good solution, but this other solution may be a better solution because it's going to fit within our budget and we only have 3 years to be able to do this. And then you could actually find yourself coming all the way back around to that first solution you came up with because of the multidimensional problem. You can actually keep finding solutions that are better on a different dimension, and so long as you introduce that around the table. And by the way, if you ever don't want things to happen, this is a great solution for doing that. Just keep introducing a new dimension against which the current solution doesn't work. But so long as it's multidimensional and those dimensionality problems affect whether or not we can find solutions, you can continue cycling. And this is how you can work on these issues and go to many, many, many meetings, feel like you're doing lots of work, but don't feel like you're ever getting anywhere, because you're constantly spending time cycling through the solution space. Part of the paradox there is that the solutions are neither right nor wrong often. There may be good solutions, there may be some better solutions, but you'll never have the certainty that it is the best solution. And so this I think is exactly the crux, where economists often get it wrong, and where they enter a room thinking that they have the best global solution. They've done the numbers, they've run the analysis, and they've come up with a solution. They think they've searched out the best solution, but in all of their assumptions, they've left out some of those other multidimensional problems, and that's where the mismatch happens, and that's where we speak past each other. So the solutions aren't always right or wrong, and you'll never know whether that was the best solution when you're picking it. So you'll just have that particular instance. This is the unique one-shot problem. You're only going to have that instance. You'll never have counterfactuals. You'll never know again whether what would have happened had you taken a different path. So what we need to do as researchers who are advising policymakers and practitioners, and this is where I found the research that's been most effective in doing this. I'm not pretending that any of my research is most effective in doing this, but what I have done is been able to observe and watch people that are good at doing this. What they're able to do is take into account that this is extremely complicated. They may not always have a wicked problem, but they know that it's extremely complicated. They're comfortable with the fact that they may not ever find the best solution. And they are able to present multiple solutions and explain why one or two of them may be slightly better on some of the dimensions and they may have shortcomings on other dimensions. And demonstrate to people that they need to eventually have a stopping rule, otherwise you're going to cycle through these solutions forever. That's when good policy and good practice can actually benefit from that research. So if you can remind people when you're working on this, and in this case I'm speaking to the researchers, because it's your job to understand the complexity and to communicate hopefully some of that complexity, but also be able to simplify it for the policymaker practitioner. If you can understand that, then you will be able to communicate that you're never going to have exactly the right answer, but a good answer may be better than no answer. That you'll never know the counterfactual, and that you may always wonder what if, but that's okay, and I'll get to reasons why that's okay in a minute. So this is the features of wicked problems. This is why I remind people of them. because I think they're extremely salient for the problems that we're dealing with in fragile and conflict-affected states. But at the same time that they're very depressing, as you look at this and you say, wow, how am I ever going to come up with solutions for these problems? It's also a little liberating once you realize this, because then you realize, oh, if I'm able to identify that it's a wicked problem, then I know that these rules are now in place, right? So this is how I will design policy or practice, or I'll advise with research on these issues. I want to talk a little bit about poverty. I'll go quickly through these 2 slides, because I've been thinking a lot about poverty over the last couple of months, and I'm delighted now with the extra time that I have at SIPRI and not working at the bank that I can actually write. And so we've done 2 papers. This is the first one I've done with the International Futures folks at the University of Denver, where they have this giant systems model. It's a great model if you get a chance to look at it. And we projected forward what might be possible trends on poverty reduction in all countries up to 2030 to figure out what was likely or possible given the post-2015 new Millennium Development Goals or agenda. So in this outer circle pie, you can see that right now the fragile component of poverty represents about 200 million of the 1.2 million, 200 million of the 1.2 billion people that are living under $1.25 a day in the world in 2010. By 2030, we expect that share to grow. It'll be about 231 million by the time we get to 2030, and non-fragile will be decreasing because we're going to see a lot of development in the non-fragile, non-conflict affected states, down to 387. So where they are taking off, we're going to see an increased concentration for exactly the countries we're talking about, we're interested in by virtue of the fact that you're here in this room. This is the bubble graph showing, this is the 2010, the current state of where those people are located by country. So a lot of it concentrated in DRC, Myanmar, and Madagascar. And we're going to see increasing concentration in DRC, Madagascar, Malawi, Mali, etc. So that's where we're going to have these enclaves of poverty. And our concern in writing this paper was, what are realistic goals we can set so that we're not leaving people behind? And knowing that we're going to be in this case in 2030, how can we frame those goals? How can we talk about those goals so that we can have real achievements still in 2030? We don't have a parade that celebrates that we've eradicated poverty when we can still see those 300 million people living in enclaves of poverty in these countries. How do we respond to that, and how do we frame it properly now so we don't regret it 15 years down the road? The second paper that I've done is about poverty reduction, and it takes a slightly different tack. I'm really interested in what we can learn from past experiences of poverty reduction. And it turns out when you look at a lot of these poverty reduction strategies, when you look at a lot of country assistance strategies, now the new country diagnostics, that while there may be good analysis that goes into those, very rarely is there good ex post analysis of whether or not it was right and whether or not what we've learned from those experiences. And I started thinking about that problem, and I was writing a chapter for a volume that Lawrence Chandy and Homi Karas are doing for Brookings, and they were talking about, well, how do we push that last extra mile of poverty reduction to be able to try to hit that 2030 target? And so I said, well, what's really realistic given past historical experiences? And so I started looking at the data, the limited data we have, and I took poverty reduction experiences, periods, for every country for which we have data over the last 30, 40 years on poverty, both national poverty levels and the $1.25 a day data that we have. And it was really unfortunate that it was exactly the same time that they were releasing the recalibrated PPPs, because that meant I had to do it twice. But in any event, what we did was take historical experiences of what countries have been able to do, and then rather than doing a giant regression that just pulls them all together and says, well, most developing countries look like this, I said, let's simulate what it would be like if DRC, for example, these are DRC by the way, were to replicate the paths of other countries that are like the DRC, rather than just all developing countries, because the DRC cannot be Ecuador, Chile, or Peru. But what if the DRC were able to replicate the paths of other countries that are like the DRC? And so that's what I'm calling this 1,000 paths approach. It's a giant Monte Carlo simulation that goes through and it takes out what are the similar characteristics of other countries, and then what were they capable of doing in the past, and then what would happen if DRC did that. So the blue lines over here show the 10 kind of best performers of the most similar countries to the DRC. And the red lines over here show the 10 kind of worst performers of the most similar countries to DRC. Given those, that gives me, as a policymaker then, if I switch hats, a much better sense of what's possible in the DRC. I'm certainly not going to get to 0, and I'm probably going to get somewhere between 40 and 65 on poverty headcount if things go really well, if I'm able to mimic what others have done. And if things don't go well, my odds are I'm going to get to somewhere around 70 on the poverty headcount. Now I've included in there the dashed line which shows a regression, but I think that the range of these possible paths is much more informative than that dashed line is. And the way that it's also informative is you can then take this analysis and you can say, which are the countries that we could learn from? So which were the blue ones and which ones are the red ones? The blue ones are nice guideposts. Let's go look at their cases and figure out what we should learn from their experiences. So I have some write-ups in there about interesting similarities with, for example, Kyrgyz Republic and Cambodia for the DRC. Or what should we avoid doing? Tanzania is a good example of things you should avoid doing if you want to have good poverty reduction in the DRC. All of that kind of opens that solution space up so you have more to talk about with policymakers and practitioners. And I think that that's the kind of research that can help us to be able to accelerate and create that virtuous cycle of knowledge exchange that Tia was talking to earlier. And the important thing, I think one of the important things to take away from that is this third bullet, second bullet, is that we constantly remind ourselves that context matters, right? And yet we have to believe, if we're researchers and academics, that knowledge transfers, right? So we need to square that circle in some sense. And the way we can do that, I think, is by turning to past experience, figuring out what is relevant, and then helping to apply that. And that's how we bridge that, also that South-South knowledge exchange that I was talking about earlier. All right, I'm going to go quickly on this because I'm sure you're all familiar with it. In the WDR, we said that no fragile states were going to be able to make MDGs. Now, roughly about 25% will by next year, so I'm delighted that that has changed. This is the current kind of data from the GMR, the World Bank data dashboards on these various MDGs, but you can see the number of countries that we have that are going to fall short, both because they have insufficient data, we just don't know whether they're going to make it or not, and because they're seriously off target. And although we're up to now 25%, you can see that over here, for the rest of the developing world, the fragile states are lagging far behind. So this is going to continue to be a development challenge as we enter into the post-2015 world, which is what all of New York is talking about now and in the next couple of weeks, right? Who is fragile? I will not spend very much time on this also because you're both familiar with it. But we have this list of fragile states at the bank, and the Failed Fragile States Index now creates this list. OECD combines the two lists. But I think what's important here is that this conceptualization is changing. It's moving over time, reflecting a institutional embeddedness that is evolving. We are continually kind of updating, and even the bank is saying, well, wait a minute, there are other countries, or there are other societies, there are other subnational regions, there are some areas of middle-income countries that are fragile. We should be thinking about those. And that, I think, is a telling point of where we are in this conversation. We've moved from never talk to us about fragility in our country to Mexico now calling the World Bank and asking to work on conflict, crime, and violence and the effects on development. So that engagement, I think, reflects a lot of evolution. 2 more slides. First, about development where it looks like it's going in the post-2015 world. As I said, it does not look good for these countries, but that doesn't mean we should give up for 3 reasons. One, we have new methods and approaches, including many of the things we're learning right now, including many of the things we're learning from research like this, that we can apply so that we can do better jobs in the future. So maybe that 1 or 2% point reduction on poverty headcount in the past, we can accelerate that. Maybe we can do better if we apply that information. Also, if we're really serious about eradicating poverty, so we have all these leaders come out and say we can eradicate poverty by 2030. If we're serious about doing it, then all of our investments, we should be scaling up the investments now, because those investments will compound in the growth and development that we're going to have over the next 15 years. We cannot wait until 2025 to say, oh, now there's all this fragile poverty, we should do something about that. No, we have to be doing it right now to reap any of those compounded effects. And we constantly have new resources coming online, including new researchers who are finishing their PhDs and who can go out and bring their brilliance to these issues. It's a generational endeavor. If you've read even the executive summary of the WDR, you know how long it takes for this type of development to happen. Not only does that mean there's job security for people working on these issues, but it allows the time for specialization and focus. So there is no rush. You don't have to go and do 6 months in one country and 6 months, move to the next country and do these consultancies. Take the time to invest in understanding the country for exactly the context, knowledge, and embeddedness that we were talking about. It allows the donors time for developing longer interventions. There's no reason why we should be designing things with political cycles that we have in developed countries and in the donor world, when we can be applying things that we know are much better for these countries over long periods with the commitment. And the advantage of longer interventions is it allows you time. First of all, you reduce the volatility, but it allows you time to adapt your program over time. You can learn from the first wave, you can learn from the first rollout, from the first phase, and you can adapt it. You can create feedback loops, you can do constant monitoring and updating. This project-driven iterative adaptation that Pritchett and Wilcock have been talking about. And it allows everybody time for better strategic planning, reminding us once again that this sequencing problem is a wicked problem. There is no right sequencing. And this is where we constantly run it, we're constantly clashing. Sequencing is a wicked problem, and anybody who tells you, no, the sequencing should be ABC, they're avoiding that problem, and it may be at the cost of success in the country. So we have to remind ourselves that absolutely sequencing is important, but that there is no necessary right sequencing, certainly not across contexts. So those are the challenges for development. Where do I see this research going? I think the conceptualization of fragility will continue to evolve. I expect that in the next year and a half, the bank, for example, will be talking more about subnational regions. We'll not be talking about fragile states, probably won't even have the language around that. It'll probably be talking about fragile situations, or areas, or regions, or difficult development, or complex development environments. That's my language, I like them, complex development environments. If you've seen that, then I've been talking somewhere to somebody, I hope. Demographic changes. These are the big challenges. I think OECD was right. They identified these in the last Fragile States Outlook. They're saying, look, we need to be concerned about urbanization and how it's going to be changing. That's going to be a different world than the world we're living in right now, as a lot of the countries that are urbanizing have to accommodate a lot more people moving into urban areas. We still have the challenges of high fertility and population growth, and it's part of what contributes to those big circles in 2030 from that first graph that I showed you. And there's tremendous youth bulges in a lot of these countries. The population pyramid doesn't look like it's just so wide. And so we need to figure out ways to be able to help policymakers think about how to include those people in the economy and in society. We have climate change challenges, but all of that, and I hope there's some people in the room that are working on how we can use new data, new methods, and new approaches, precisely because of the last slide. I think we're going to need those if we want to accelerate. If we want to do things differently, we're going to need these technologies to be able to respond to these challenges. I hope that there are people working on all the new data sets that we have. There is always a demand for more data and new data, but there's lots of data that's come online recently that needs to be absorbed And so I hope that people are using it and applying it. And I love new data techniques. Big data, for example, I think is really interesting. What we as a society, as a community, need to figure out how we're going to reconcile those new techniques to our methods, our social science methods. We do have methods, we want to make sure that they work together, and that we're not introducing new big data approaches that lose some of that contextual understanding that we've developed and we've invested a lot in. We're always going to have the paradox of timely policy advice that is just in time, that responds, and being able to do the high quality research we have. But I really like the initiative of the Academy and these integrated things where we're working with bilaterals, we're working with aid agencies, we're working with MFAs, and we're saying, how can you both support research that's open-ended and has, they can go pursue their own research agendas, but be able to tap that knowledge and understanding and bring it into the building for people to be able to work. Because I guarantee there's lots of timely policy advice that's happening because people are connected in to those networks. And increasingly, you're going to be finding that your skill set, your knowledge of fragility and conflict is going to be applicable as middle-income countries realize that they are grappling with some of these same issues and that they want to apply some of that understanding. It may even be the case that we start competing for people with this skill set because both middle-income countries need that skill set and the developing countries need that skill set. So these are all the challenges. I hope that that's positive because it means there's a huge research agenda out there. There's lots of interesting questions to answer. I hope that the wicked problems haven't scared you off. If they have scared you off, I'm sorry, but this is the challenge that we're dealing with. But it shows why we keep evolving and creating a bigger community and how the things like the IS Academy have contributed to that. So thank you very much.